Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, Panda Boot Creates. I'm Andrea. Today we are going to be making personalized baby blankets using both HTV and infusible ink. Let's get started. So you can see here, I'm on the home screen of Design Space, so we're just going to click New Project. And if you don't know Design Space, I did make a previous video showing you what all these buttons are for over here. So if you're confused by any of that, maybe refer to that video first before looking at this one. Okay, so for both the HTV and the infusible ink, you'll obviously need text. You write the baby's name, and you can pick whatever font you want. I'm just going to stick with this one for now. And then you can make it whatever size you need it to be. So you should measure the blanket ahead of time. See how big you want it to be on the blanket. If you want it to be the whole width of the blanket, then obviously that would be your width. And the height will change based on the ratio. You can also unlock it to make the height whatever you want. It will just make it not as proportional as it is here. So let's say it's 20. It'll be nice and big. And then you can write if you want to cut, draw, score, engrave, wave, all that jazz. So I want to cut this because it's going to be HTV. For my infusible ink, I need to pick a font that is a writing font. So you can see here where it says single layer cutting or writing. You want ones that say writing. If you're going to cut with infusible ink sheets, then it's the same thing. You need to cut it. But if you're going to use pens, it needs to be writing. It won't cut with pens, obviously. So in order to filter it down, you can filter it here, pick writing, and it'll show you all the ones that are writing only or cutting and writing. Because I have Cricut access, all of these are free to me. I just have to download them. If you don't have Cricut access, it'll tell you the price on the side here that you can pay for it. Now you just pick a font that you like. I'll pick this one. It's cute. Download it. And now it's good to go. Click on it and it'll change. Oops. And it'll change my name. Now, you'll notice that with some cursive fonts, actually most cursive fonts, it'll look like this where it's separated. You can make it all unison and come together if you want, especially with writing. It looks kind of weird. With cutting, you can cut it like that and then just put it together on your actual project. It's up to you. But for that, you would ungroup it. So now every letter is its own letter, and you can just move it to be where it should be so it looks like it's actually cursive. There. And then you'd highlight it all and hit Weld. You can also attach it. The difference with Weld is it takes out all of the overlapping lines. So if we zoom in, you see how where it overlapped, it is now one continuous thing. You can also see that I didn't do a very good job overlapping them completely. But with attach, you would still have that line. So if it was drawing the outline like this, you would have a line going here, which obviously isn't a big deal if you're coloring it in anyway, but if you're not, and say this is a lot bigger, so the gap is a lot more noticeable, you would see that line and it would look weird. And with cutting, it would cut that, so it wouldn't even matter that you combined it all together. You've now made separate letters anyway. So you want to weld it so that it's all one word, one cut, one writing, one continuous thing. It's not that attach is wrong necessarily, it might make more work for you. To note with weld though is you can't undo it. So if I were to save this right now, I can't undo this weld. I can undo it before I save it with Control Z. See, you can see that here. I can undo it now, but I won't be able to undo it if I hit save. So make sure that when you weld it and you save it, that it's exactly how you want it to be, because you'll never see it that way again. So if you want to be able to edit this in the future, then maybe make a copy before you weld it. So we'll go ahead and weld this again. And now it's going to give me an error because it is too big for my mat. See. So if I make this 23, my error goes away. So the biggest mat that you have is 12 by 24. If it is bigger than that and it is one solid image or writing or cut, it can't fit on one mat. It won't let you do it. So if these were all individual letters and I could break them up to be more than one mat, then it won't yell at me. But once it's one solid thing, it doesn't know how to break that up, nor do you really want it to break that up. So it would have to fit on the mat. So that's something to keep in mind. So for one of the blankets that I did where it was both the first name and the middle name, I had the first name as one solid thing and the middle name as one solid thing, and I made sure that that would fit on my mat one name at a time because it wouldn't both fit on the mat. And then with Remington, I only had his first name, so I made that as big as I could. And then when we're done, we go to make it. And it will rotate it so that it fits. You can obviously rotate it however you want, but I don't know why you would want to put it on an angle instead of just this. You'd waste less material, but you can if you need to or want to. You mirror it, especially if it's infusible ink. You'll mirror anything that goes on to clothes usually. It all depends on the instructions, obviously. So Siser HTV, for example, you don't have to mirror, but, well, some of them you don't have to mirror. But for Cricut HTV, you usually do. For infusible ink, pretty much anything you usually do. Sometimes you just have to sit there and think about, okay, how is this going to cut out? And how, if I flip it over and put it onto my surface, is it going to read the way I want it to? And in this case, if it printed out so that it spelled out Remington the right way, when I flipped it over, it wouldn't spell Remington the right way. Because you can't, the ink has to be, like the ink will be on the top, and when you need it to be on the bottom to put it on to the blanket, right? So it's just thinking about it ahead of time. And there are plenty of instructions that will tell you what to do. You just have to find them. That's the hard part. So I just try to think about it ahead of time. And then you can continue. Okay, so because I have the maker, my maker will show up here. In the actual design space, it asks you what machine you have. That limits what options you have in the design space. If you don't know what I'm talking about, refer to my design space video. But it should tell you what machine you have here. So for infusible ink pens, your material would be printer paper. So you can just search here if it's not readily available for you to see. So you can see here that they have a bunch of different kinds of paper. For our case, it's copy paper, same thing. And then you have to pick the GSM. That should be on your package of paper or pounds. So in my case, it's 24. Click that one. Done. And it'll tell you to put your pen in clamp A. Now, 0.4, there are different thicknesses. But for infusible ink, I believe there's only one thickness. For actual pens, there are more than one thickness. So in this case, we would want whatever infusible ink pen color you want for the words. Don't mind the 0.4 pen part of that. And then there's nothing in clamp B. And if we had the cut to cut the HTV, there would be nothing in clamp A, and there would be a fine point blade in clamp B. And then pressure wise, it was blacked out now because we're doing a pen and you can't choose an option with a pen. But for clamp B, you would want to put it on less. I've said this in my previous videos. I always try to put less because I find with default sometimes it's a little too hard, especially with new tools. So you might end up cutting through your mat, or at least scratching it, like going through the material and scratching it. So I always put it on less, check to see if it's cut all the way through before I unload it. And if it hasn't, then press the Cricut button again. It'll do it again. Once you unload it, you can't put it back in to cut over it again because it won't be exactly the same spot. And sometimes that is very noticeable. You don't want it to be slightly off, like even 0.5 of a millimeter. You're going to have this weird thin cut piece of vinyl. So make sure before you unload the mat. And then it'll tell you what buttons to press. They'll flash on your machine. You can press them and get to cutting or writing. So once I have my writing all done on my Cricut, I'm going to preheat my blanket using parchment paper for 5 to 10 seconds. This is just to pre-warm it up. It helps the infusible ink adhere better. I'm going to make sure it's all flat, invert the name so that the ink is facing downwards, put the parchment paper back on top so that it doesn't bleed through onto my heat press. Set my heat press to 385 for 40 seconds. Press the button and hold it there for about medium pressure until it beeps. Note that my heat press mat is below the blanket, and if this was a shirt or something, you'd have parchment paper on the other side so that it doesn't bleed through. But since it's a blanket, I don't have to worry about it bleeding through. It's nice and thick. I did have to go over the writing a few more times just to make it extra thick. The Cricut made it pretty thin, and I was worried it wouldn't show up very well on the blanket, so I went over it a few more times to make it thick. That's why you might see some squiggle lines that don't necessarily belong. And then once my heat press beeps, I take it off. I take the parchment paper off, and you don't have to let it cool down. You can remove the paper right away. I just let it there for a few seconds just to let it adhere, and then you take it away and you can see the results. So you can see where the heat line is, but if you run your hands over it, it should go back to the way that the rest of the blanket is. I did notice that it might be a little too high of heat because the discoloration is, it's not super noticeable, but it's there. I can notice it. So for my next blanket, I will definitely be turning down the heat. And then I repeat this process for the middle name. I just have to shift over my heat press mat and preheat it like I did before. And put the middle name down. And we're good to go. I would like to note that these are the pens. If you want something thicker or you want a pattern, then there are infusible ink sheets. You would cut that similar to HTV, and you would invert it just like I inverted the pens, and it would make it the same way, but it obviously would look a little different. And this is adorable little Morgan enjoying her finished blanket. Isn't she so cute? Okay, so like I said before, the Siser HTV, you don't have to mirror it. So you can see here that the vinyl top, the transfer paper is on top of the words as opposed to behind it. So if it was behind it, I would have to have mirrored the name, but in this case I don't. This is why it's very important to read directions or to seriously think about it before cutting. So I've placed it on the blanket where I need it to be, and now I heat my heat press up to 305 for 30 seconds. This was recommended by the heat guide on the Caesars website for 100% polyester blankets. I also wanted to find a heat that was lower than the 385 I used before, just to try to avoid discoloration, especially because with darker colors, I find it's a little more obvious if it's discolored. I didn't preheat this one. I typically only preheat if it's infusible ink, not if it's HTV, but it is a good idea to preheat it with HTV as well. I'm just lazy, I guess. So use your parchment paper, preheat it for 5 to 10 seconds, like I did with the infusible ink. And then put your name on the blanket, put parchment paper over top of it, and put your heat press on it for as long as it tells you to, or until it beeps. And then in this case, my name was actually bigger than my heat press, so I actually had to redo the edges of both the R and the N at the end. If you notice ahead of time that it's going to be bigger than your heat press, then obviously just do half and half. In my case, I didn't notice until I was looking at the letters and the letters weren't fully adhered. So don't make my mistake and check ahead of time. In the heat guide instructions, it says that you can peel hot or cold. I am a wimp when it comes to heat, so I typically will peel warm to cold. I don't like to try to burn myself as I'm peeling it away, especially for something like this where you want to make sure that you're not peeling away the letters. You're really holding on to that paper. So if it's too hot for you to touch, wait until you can bear to touch it for longer than a few seconds. And then you peel it away slowly, making sure it's sticking to the blanket the whole time. And then you're done. And you just smooth out the rest of the blanket, making sure that you didn't totally ruin it. I did see a little bit of discoloration, but not nearly as much as I did from the infusible ink blanket. So I think the lower heat definitely works. We'll probably have to put it on longer for infusible ink than for HTV. So if I put it on at 305 for infusible ink, I'm not really sure that it would work because infusible ink usually has higher temperatures. But maybe I could try that someday where I try the lower temperature and just longer. And here's a cute picture of Remington with his blanket. All the babies love their blankets. Aren't they adorable? Shameless side note, using babies to make my video more interesting, but I couldn't help it. They're so cute. And they prove that these baby blankets are awesome. So you should make one for your friends and family, or for yourself if you're having a baby. Hopefully you liked this video. Hopefully you learned something. The moral of the story is I recommend the infusible ink sheets over HTV or infusible ink pens. Unfortunately, that's not actually shown in this video, but it would look a lot more like Morgan's blanket than Remington's. With Remington's, I did notice that the difference in feel between the soft blanket and the vinyl felt kind of weird. Obviously, that only matters if you're rubbing your hand over it constantly, but I'd like it to all be one feel and not feel like you might lose a letter at any point in time. Obviously, that's your preference on what you want, but that's just what I recommend. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you guys for watching.